a pink scarf. Yes. Hi there, Yolanda. Yolanda. Yes, right there.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. My name is Yolanda Morales from El Economista newspaper in Mexico. I want to know what happened with Mexico in this year, because we made the structural reforms in the past 6 years, and we couldn't see a big increase in the GDP, and now we had slower projections in the same GDP. In the last week, you launched the Article 4 for Mexico, and you said that this is the political uncertainty behind this slower. So again, I want to know what happened with our structural reforms. Thank you.
I mean, in the case of Mexico, besides policy uncertainty, it is very much the case, and this is what Jean Maria flagged also about that. What matters is what the borrowing costs are, and it is certainly the case that in the case of Mexico, interest rates are still high, and there are pretty tight financial conditions. I want to have you go on.
Yeah. So when we refer about political uncertainty, we mean there is uncertainty about the fate of some of the structural reforms, and that, of course, can take a toll on investment, and it has. We have, as Gita mentioned, tight monetary policy conditions, and we've had an under-execution of the budget, which has taken a toll on activity in the earlier part of this year. So we think that should wane eventually, but it has weighed on activity. And Mexico, of course, has been subject to external shocks, uncertainty in its economic relations with the United States. Think of what happened on the migration front relatively recently. And also, Mexico is actually a big manufacturing center, and there is a big global downturn in manufacturing. And while, of course, Mexico can benefit to some extent by some trade diversion when there are more barriers between the US and China, it does suffer when global manufacturing activity is under stress, as is the case at the moment.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last question here, and we'll move back to the left side. First row, AP.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rafael, for the opportunity. Good morning. I'm Luis Alonso with the AP, and I would like to stay in Latin America, if that's possible. I would like to ask you about Ecuador, because it has been in the news over the last few days. Did President Moreno make the right decision, canceling the austerity package in the IMF view? What will happen with the program in Ecuador? And also would like to ask a more comprehensive question. Do recent outcomes in both Ecuador and Argentina hurt the IMF reputation in Latin America and globally? Thank you.
I mean, I should first start by saying that we express our deepest sympathies for the people who have been injured and the people who have, I mean, some have even died in the violence in Ecuador, and we very much welcome that there is an attempt to bring in all the stakeholders and to make decisions about macro reforms, taking into account the various communities that are going to be affected by it. So quite simply, we stand ready, we stand in support of the authorities. These are challenging times, and we would like to see that the reforms get done and that they're successful. To your question about Argentina and Ecuador, I mean, the only thing I will point out is that the IMF goes into these countries when these are stressful times, when there are difficult situations, and it's unfortunate that there are difficulties that the people have to face. But this is the challenge that we deal with. It's the challenge that the authorities in these countries deal with. And it's always our intent to do the best for the people in these countries, working closely with the authorities.
Thank you. So we're going to switch back to this side. I'm going to go fourth row, lady in red, please.
Aling Liu with Eisai Media Group. Trade volume growth has dropped dramatically in the first half to 1% and is projected to rebound to 3.2%. So what's the main driver of this pickup? Thank you.
There are several factors behind it. I mean, on the one hand, there is the trade policy uncertainty, trade barriers, but there's also a lot going on in other areas, like in the auto sector. I'll have Jung Maria go into it.
Yes. Part of the explanation for the rebound is, of course, that there is a bit of a pickup in global activity projected for next year, and that's a recovery in investment, that's a recovery in trade. You also have to think we have what we call a base effect. Fundamentally, trade has been very weak in 2019, so just some normalization in the later part of 2019 and early 2020 will give you a notably positive growth rate. And in terms of specifics, clearly the car sector has been weighing heavily on manufacturing activity and growth, and some stabilization improvement of the situation in the car sector would lead to a recovery in trade. The same is true for semiconductors. The so-called tech cycle was one contributor to the big weakening in global trade, and we've seen it in the numbers for countries in East Asia, where exports have suffered more than elsewhere. And again, there we see a little bit of a pickup. So all these factors together lead us to expect some recovery in global trade. It's not a great recovery. If you look at the overall growth number, it's still relatively modest, but it's better than 2019.
Thank you. So I'm gonna go here in the second row. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. Jane Tan with Sina News. I noticed you mentioned several factors in the Asia economic forecast. One of it is the spillover from the US trade war, the other is the still down of China growth. I want to ask, how concerned are you for the situation ongoing in Hong Kong for the global economic growth and the financial stability? Thank you.
I mean, in Hong Kong, we've actually had a significant revision down for growth in Hong Kong in 2019. We expect some recovery in 2020. In 2019, it's a combination of the trade tensions, the slowdown in trade, but also the slowing down in the structural slowdown in China. And it's also an outcome of the social unrest. We've seen declines in tourism, for instance, and in retail sales. But we expect there to be a recovery for Hong Kong going forward. In terms of the spillovers to the global growth, they remain quite small at this point.
All right. I'm going to go all the way back. The colleague from Soleil de Dakar. Yes, sir.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Abdou Diaw, Dakar, Sénégal. J'avais une question.
Attendez, on va juste prendre la traduction. Attendez.
OK.
Do you have your Oh. Or otherwise I can translate if you want.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No, allez-y.
Abdou Diaw, Dakar, Sénégal. J'avais une question sur la zone de libre-échange continentale. Est-ce que vous avez, dans ce rapport, prévu quand même évaluer l'impact de la mise en œuvre de cette zone de libre-échange continentale au plan commercial pour l'Afrique dans vos études, qui est un projet de l'agenda contenu dans l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine, la zone de libre-échange continentale. Merci beaucoup.
So the question is about the free trade agreement in Africa and how this would impact the growth in Senegal and Africa. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So that was a very favorable development in a world where we see trade barriers rising. African countries do not trade much with each other, so greater facilitation of trade and lower tariff barriers would help greatly and create opportunities for new opportunities for growth. It's a longer-term, medium to long-term issue. It also creates upside potential, and we would expect, if implementation progresses fast, we would expect this to have a positive impact over the medium term, much needed given the demographics of Africa. Many jobs will have to be created given a young population. I would stop there.
All right. I'm going to move to this side all the way back. The gentleman, I guess it's in the row before last. Right there. Yes, sir. Right there, the gentleman with the beard. Yes.
This is Khalik Kiani from Dawn newspaper, Pakistan, here.
Yeah.
In your view, what is going to be the impact of this renewed tension on Kashmir on regional economic outlook, India and Pakistan specifically? And since you have already mentioned India, what is your view about the outlook, economic growth outlook for Pakistan?
Would you like to take that?
Yes. Well, as you know, Pakistan has started implementing an ambitious program with the IMF. There is need for substantial fiscal adjustment. The deficit over the last year has exceeded expectations. Fortunately, this has been the case mostly for one-off reasons, and tax revenues are picking up notably. But of course, when you do have fiscal adjustment ongoing, domestic demand is going to be compressed, and hence we have a forecast for the growth rate that in the short run is going to decline, 3.3 2019, 2.4 in 2020, but pick up after that. And we think there are good signs on the confidence front with increased demand for local currency assets by foreign investors in light of the fact that we now have an exchange rate that is more reflecting actual economic conditions with some degree of floating. And the authorities have been steadfast in their implementation of the program. Challenges remain, of course. It's a set of macroeconomic imbalances that need to be addressed. There are uncertainties. You mentioned one of them. There are others. Oil prices. Pakistan is a large oil importer, and hence very sensitive to what happens to oil prices. But so far, we have seen good signs, and we hope that there will be a notable pickup in growth over the medium term, which is sorely needed in Pakistan to lift living standards. For India, I think Geeta already addressed the general outlook. Overall growth remains very strong by the standards of the world economy, even though it's lower than the very high standards at which we were accustomed to in looking at India. So a growth rate above 6% is still notable and extremely important in a country that has such a large population. We have a forecast for a further pickup next year. Also helped by tax cuts on the corporate front. There again, there are many macroeconomic challenges. Again, Geeta has emphasized the need to keep the fiscal deficit under control. And of course, India and Pakistan are not immune to global geopolitical tensions and to trade tensions that can take a toll on their manufacturing activity and demand for their exports.
Thank you, Jamaria. We'll have time for one or two questions. I'll start with the gentleman in the middle, fourth row, on the right-hand side. Yes, sir, you. Mic is coming too. No, right here. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. This is Huanxin Zhao from China Daily, USA. In the World Economic Outlook, page 38, you noted that there is a sharp decline in foreign direct investment among major economies last year. And this is especially the case for FDI between China and the United States. So my question is, how do you evaluate the FDI decline's influence on the world economy, and what is the way to reverse it? Thank you.
And we have this very nice box in the wheel, which is about what's happening with FDI, and you see this decline in FDI, and an important factor for that is basically the changes in tax rules, so including the tax policy changes in the U.S. But I'll have Jeremy go into it in more detail.
Yes. So at the global level, really the main impact, the main reason why we see a very large decline in FDI is fundamentally a restructuring of the internal financial activities of multinational corporations. There is repatriation of cash by U.S. multinational corporations in light of U.S. tax changes, which have virtually no impact on economic activity. These may be funds invested in US dollar securities from overseas, and with the tax change, they're now invested in the very same US dollar securities, but from the US. So absolutely no change. But you hint to a different set of issues, which may be is definitely of more relevance for global financial integration, which is what could be the implications of increased fragmentations or trade tensions, which could, one aspect of that could be a decline in foreign direct investment among major regions when we are talking about greenfield investment, about mergers and acquisitions, and so on. And it is clearly way too early to be able to assess how much is actually happening. These are typically data that are released with a longer lag, and because they mix together financial operations with real investment, it is a bit difficult to tell them apart. But of course, the potential for increased fragmentation to reduce the efficiency of production, to reduce productivity growth is there, and it is one of the major concerns we have in regard to an increase in trade and investment barriers.
All right, I'm going to take the last question from online. Thanks for all the colleagues that have been patiently waiting online. So the question is on Saudi Arabia. The question is, do you believe that the Saudi reforms and non-oil sector could both bypass the current forces pushing towards lowering growth projections?
So in the case of Saudi Arabia, we had a revision down for their growth for 2019, and an important part of that was basically weakness in the oil sector. So in the weakness as in lower oil production, tied to new OPEC plus rules. So the lower oil production is one of the factors for the downgrade for 2019. But we expect things to improve, and in fact, the non-oil sector has been doing better over time, and that looks good. But it is clearly the case that an important downside risk remains geopolitical tensions in the region, and also, of course, if the global economy were to slow, the negative impact of that on oil prices could also be an important downside risk for Saudi Arabia.
Okay, with that, I would like to conclude, but I think Gita has one last announcement.
Yes, I just wanted to point out and thank my colleague here, Oya Chalison. This is going to be, at least maybe for a short while, this is going to be her last presentation here, and while she moves on to higher and more important things.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure interacting with all of you. Thank you.
All right, thank you again, and I hope to see you around for the next couple of days. Thank you.